As of right now, the Brewers are undefeated. I'm Charlie Sykes. Sunday Insight starts right now. Good morning and welcome to Sunday Insight. In the week that was a nuclear deal with Iran, well, more like a framework. Disappointing jobs numbers raise questions about the economy. Civil rights pioneer Orville Pitts dies at the age of 81. A massacre targets Christians in Kenya. The Rolling Stones book a date in Milwaukee. Badger basketball madness in the NCAA tournament. And yes, it's finally here. Opening day is tomorrow at Miller Park. But we start with a firestorm over religious freedom and gay rights. It is called a Religious Freedom Restoration Act. At the federal level, Bill Clinton signed one back in 1993. Barack Obama voted for a religious freedom bill when he was in the Illinois State Senate. The bills establish a balancing test. Government can burden the free exercise of religion only when it can show there's a compelling state interest and the actions are the minimum necessary. But last week, a massive backlash against a religious freedom bill in Indiana and a similar one in Arkansas, with critics saying the bills would make it easier to discriminate against gays and might be used, for example, to allow a florist to refuse to provide flowers for a gay wedding. Both states quickly modified their bills, but it left a lingering question. What are the limits of religious freedom and of gay rights? Joining me on our panel this morning, defense attorney Dan Adams, the managing editor of RightWisconsin.com, Colin Roth, political strategist Linda Bruin, and media trackers Brian Sikma. So at the end of the week, who won this back and forth with Indiana, Brian Sikma?
Well, I do think that the media scored points, as well as liberal opponents of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And a lot of that came about because it was a shocking development, because this law doesn't really govern person-to-person actions. This law was all about making sure that the government was limited. The government couldn't be the one imposing a burden on a person of any faith, whether they were Christian, whether they were Jewish, Islamic, Hindu, or anything. This was about protecting all religious faiths from government action. But they erected a very powerful straw man argument and tried to turn this into a debate about gay rights.
Okay. Dan Adams.
Wrong. This law, unlike the federal law, actually does govern private party interactions and commerce. And from gay Americans' perspective, this allows a for-profit business to basically say gays not need apply to be employees, gays need not apply to be customers, and that's just wrong.
Okay, but that's never happened before, and that really was the straw man. But okay, let's assume for the sake of argument, though, that the law would have meant that a florist or a baker would not be compelled to serve at a gay wedding. Should a florist and a photographer, should they have the right to have a religious objection to participating in a ceremony that violates their conscience?
An individual, if it was a nonprofit or a church, absolutely. Religious freedom is paramount. But if it's a a business, a for-profit business, a corporation,
a photographer
should not. No, if they're incorporated, if they're actually a business entity. When I go to church, I don't sit next to Berkshire Hathaway or a corporation in the pew. They shouldn't have religious rights.
So you're saying a mom and pop baker or a pizza shop or a photographer should be compelled, should have to go, no matter what their beliefs are, that they should not have a religious objection. I mean, exemption.
If they are holding themselves out in commerce, they should provide a service and not discriminate against people because of their sexual orientation.
Okay, but that wasn't the question. It wasn't their sexual orientation. It's whether to participate in that event.
No, that's discrimination,
Well, that sounds like being a conscript. So if you have a Muslim baker and you go in and you say, I want you to make a cake for a same, and they say, no, I'm sorry, that violates our Islamic faith. You're saying that the state should step in and say that they are violating discrimination laws.
The difference here in this law compared to a lot of the laws that other conservatives have brought up across the country is that for the first time it deals with business, incorporated businesses, and trying to say that they have the right to do that. And the problem with that is that if you change it, you change the words to African Americans and go back 100 years, this is the same thing as being able to deny service to people of color.
Is this what?
To me, it is exactly the same thing.
So you are basically now saying that you are racializing this, so that somebody who believes in the marriages between a man and a woman is in the same status as a racist?
I'm saying if you believe that homosexuality and the rights of gay people is a protected class, just like race and gender and religion, etc., then you have to extend it.
So the tolerance only goes one way.
Yeah, You're absolutely right. This is about a balancing test. These cases are very, very rare, and this is all that's asking is that the government and the judicial system apply a standard for religious freedom in this, that they consider these things.
What I think is extraordinary, was what Dan Adams is laying out, is we've gone from a, hey, let's tolerate one another's different views, let's live and let live, to no, your acceptance and your participation is now mandatory. That is a tipping point.
I think you're absolutely right, Charlie. Tolerance has now been turned into something, and anti-discrimination has been turned on its head. It's not just about recognizing that if you have whatever faith background you come from, it doesn't have to be Christian, it could be any number of faiths around the world, and whatever perspective you have about sexuality or anything, those two are no longer compatible. It's now that the faith has to be suppressed at the expense of sexuality. In reality, people should be free to believe what they want to believe about those issues without being forced to change their beliefs.
I'm sorry for interrupting. People are free to believe what they want to believe. They're free to they're free to act within their own individual lives as well. They can choose where they work, etc. But when you are running a business that is open to the public, then the discrimination laws have to be balanced by that religious freedom. And I think this law went too far. I'm glad they fixed it.
Okay, now can I interrupt you?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you have a gay florist or a gay baker. Right. And the Westboro Baptist Church comes in and says, we want you to decorate our church. Should that gay florist or baker have the right to say, no, go someplace else?
Not if he's discriminating against that church because of their religious beliefs, then no.
Really?
And that's some pretty
so now tolerance has become conscription. It becomes mandatory participation.
Yeah, how free are you if you can't say no? I mean, that's the question.
Well, apparently religious freedom is within your head as opposed to what you actually do. We're in a dangerous new area. What has your glass half full? What has your glass half empty this week? Let's go around the table. Dan Adams, you're first.
Charlie, my glass is half full because the unsettling trend of colleges establishing their own inquisitions to review reports of sexual misconduct by students is finally coming to light. My glass is half empty because these campus kangaroo courts are widespread. Even Marquette University asks unqualified bureaucrats to investigate and pass quick judgment on its students. Colleges are not allowing students the opportunity to discover the facts underlying allegations, to confront witnesses, or to present a defense with aid of counsel.
Colin Roth.
My glass is half full because a group of bipartisan legislators in Madison agree that Wisconsin should facilitate rideshare programs like Uber and Lyft. But it's half empty because Madison continues to push new heavy regulations to hamper and punish the innovative and popular rideshare companies.
Linda Bruin.
Well, my glass is half full because last week federal authorities once again prevented a terrorist attack when they arrested 2 New York City women for conspiring to build a bomb meant to be used in the United States. But my glass is half empty because in the last few months there's been a spike in the number of Americans conspiring to commit terrorist attacks on American soil.
Brian Sikma.
Well, my glass is half full because the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction is working hard to advertise job openings for teachers right here in Wisconsin. But my glass is also half empty because DPI wasted $264,000 of taxpayer money on a privately owned website for job searches when taxpayers already pay for 2 state government-run job search websites already.
Well, last week, Islamist terrorists murdered 147 Christian students at a Kenyan university, singling out the victims because they were Christians and killing them for their faith. The world rightly condemned the killings, but my glass is half empty because in this country, there seemed to be a lot more outrage over a pizza shop that didn't want to cater gay weddings. Next on Sunday Insight, who will come up with the dough to build a new arena for the Bucks? A new plan for the Bucks arena. With Governor Walker's plan to sell $220 million in bonds all but dead, legislative leaders floated an alternative, a $150 million plan to borrow money through something called the Board of Commissioners of Public Lands. Yeah, I never heard of it either. Interest earned on the loan would be used to provide aid to schools around the state. Meanwhile, Mayor Tom Barrett says he still prefers Walker's plan and continues to suggest the city will provide only minor financial support. Dan Adams, where are we at on this?
Well, one, who knew that this commission and this bureau even existed? And
well, some people. Well, they used it for Lambeau Field.
And no politician has pilfered it for something already, like a pension. I don't know. Well, one thing, it's too early to pop the champagne on the deal. The devil's in the details always. But what I'm enthused about is there's no sales tax on the table. Right. There's going to be no increase in property tax, purportedly, per the mayor, for city or county. residents. So that's very good.
Colin Roth.
Yeah, it seems like a more workable solution, but it sounds like there's still a big amount of money that they got to get more from the state, city, and county. I think we heard $50 million combined, and the reluctance of the mayor to even consider TIF districts is kind of interesting at this point.
Yeah, I mean, this Bureau of Land Commissioners, it is a little bit obscure, but they did use that for Lambeau, and it will reduce the interest cost. Your thought?
Well, I think one of the big differences is some $70 million now that they'd have to figure out where that's going to come from. And plus, as you mentioned, the mayor of Milwaukee's not embracing. I think it's a riot that Barrett and Walker are actually together on something, at least temporarily.
Not really.
Not really. But then also, you've got County Executive Chris Abele, who's told the media that he's coming up with his own financing plan and has not told anyone about it.
It's way too early for us to celebrate because there's too much that we don't know about. I think one thing that would help is if the Bucks would kind of release a prospectus almost where the public could look at this and say, hey, look, this is the plan, this is what the arena is going to look like, this is the cost, the price tag with it, maybe include tiered options so as policymakers go out and work this out. Right now, we're relying on obscurely named agencies and shadow funding to try to get this thing going.
Yeah, well, Dan Adams is half right because you're right. There's no poison pill on the table. There's no sales tax, and you'll notice that there are not a lot of politicians issuing press releases attacking it, which is a good sign. On the other hand, the lack of leadership from the city is getting to be really a problem. It's a heavy lift. And I think what you're going to see is that Chris Abele is probably going to step into more of a leadership role. He's going to step in and fill the vacuum with Tom Barrett sitting there. And I'll tell you what one of the big questions is. If the things that we're being told are correct, you're talking about $1 billion of taxable development in downtown Milwaukee. If you had a tax incremental financing district, that could generate really a large amount of money, certainly at least $100 to $150 million. So when Tom Barrett says, we're not going to do a TIF district, that has everybody rolling their eyes. So I would not be surprised at all to see Abele step in and begin to provide the kind of leadership you're not getting from the city.
I expected a TIF, but I also expected, like Brian said, the Bucks to come out and say, here's the project. I mean, we're essentially being asked to pay for the car before we take it.
Know anything about it.
Exactly. Well, you may not want to hear it, but we will tell you anyway. Let's hand out some unsolicited advice. Dan Adams, you're first.
To both Democrats and Republicans in the legislature, use anti-tax activist Grover Norquist talk about criminal justice reform as a springboard to make positive changes that will increase public safety and decrease the scads of money spent on corrections in Wisconsin.
Colin Roth.
My advice is for all sides of the culture war in this country, don't make this a zero-sum game. Show some grace to those whom you disagree, respect free speech, and please don't use the heavy hammer of government to enforce an opinion or belief.
Yeah, Lynn DeBruin.
My advice is that we all vote on Tuesday. School board and judicial elections don't get much coverage, and it's hard to know the candidates, but if we don't vote, we're placing our state's legal system and our children's education in the hands of the few who do vote.
Brian Sickma.
Well, my unsolicited advice is for U.S. diplomats and political leaders negotiating with Iran. Before you start telling us about all the things you've accomplished, make sure your Iranian counterparts don't go out and publicly refute what you're saying.
Well, my unsolicited advice, I know it's Easter, I know it's spring break for a lot of folks, but take the time to vote on Tuesday, especially in the Supreme Court race and the referendum. It does matter. Next on Sunday Insight, the quiet but important election happening on Tuesday. A low turnout, low interest election with some pretty high stakes. At the top of the ballot, a race for a 10-year term on the Wisconsin State Supreme Court and a referendum on how that court picks its chief justices. A mayor's race in Madison, an election for county executive in Waukesha, and numerous local offices and judgeships. So let's go around the table. What races should we be keeping our eye on, and make any predictions you would like? Let's start with you, Colin Roth.
Well, I'm looking at the top of the ticket, and that's the statewide race for Supreme Court. And I think it's unfortunate that this has flown a little bit below the radar. There's very significant issues at play. Justice Ann Walsh Bradley is a central figure in the dysfunction of the court. She would have blocked Act 10. She would have blocked voter ID. It's something that I hope that conservatives and people who are interested in the court are motivated to vote on.
Okay, Dan Adams.
I'm going to go south to Chicago and look at the mayor race there. It is a proxy for the Democratic Party nationwide. You have the old school public sector hack and Chuy Garcia running against Rahm Emanuel, who's the more pro-business moderate Democrat, and frankly, I think the future of the Democratic Party.
No, I don't think Rahm Emanuel will be the future of the Democratic Party. I actually thought I was the only person who was going to bring up the Chicago. I am fascinated by that election and the fact that you do have this sort of the far left candidate, kind of the Bill de Blasio candidate, You can tell that you have a lot of national groups coming in who think if you get Bill de Blasio, left-wing, anti-business mayor of New York, and then Chicago.
If the public sector unions, the teachers union and AFSCME in Chicago can't win a Chicago mayor race, they're done nationally.
Who do you think is going to win that race?
Rahm.
Okay.
Absolutely.
A couple races I'm watching, Charlie, over in Waukesha County. You have the 10th Circuit Court race between Linda Vandewater and Paul Bugenhagen. Linda Vandewater is the incumbent. She's had kind of a rocky start to a rocky time in office. She hasn't really ever run unopposed. She had some incidents where she clashed with police and then with her ex-boyfriend. So it'll be interesting to see if voters remember those instances from 2011. But then also that referendum that's on the ballot between how are we going to decide the Supreme Court Chief Justice in the future. Really an interesting thing to see how that's going to change, because that could actually, as Colin mentioned, it could help the dysfunction of the court, I think. You have individuals that play a role, and if they change Chief Justice,
want to make a prediction of that Waukesha County race? Because that is an interesting one.
I think Bugenhagen seems to be leading some of the grassroots support, but it's going to be a fascinating one to watch on election night.
Well, I know that for a lot of people, because we get so little information on these judgeships, that it's hard for people to actually pick a candidate. But I actually think all the judgeships are the most important races in the state. Now, in addition to the Supreme Court justice, which is very important, you've got some 78 circuit court judges. You've got a couple of Court of Appeals judgeships. You've got several in Milwaukee County. And as you look at those,
most of them are unopposed.
Well, and it's very frustrating, because I went through the state elections board and looked at how few were opposed. And judges say they run very pro-law and order, and you're forced to afterwards look at individual cases, which is then unfair to then decide the next election. So it's a difficult process. I understand why people don't like to vote, but I do think it really will change our future as far as the law goes in Wisconsin.
The thing that will change the future is at the top of the ticket, unfortunately, in the state Supreme Court election. It's very, very, very hard to defeat an incumbent justice. So I am going to be watching very closely what happens with that referendum. This ought to be a no-brainer. There have been some ridiculously misleading ads about that referendum. I mean, the reality is the voters don't get to choose. We don't even let justices choose the Chief Justice. We have this weird, antiquated seniority system. I do not know why people are putting money, to protect that status quo. What I worry about is that the failure of conservatives to more aggressively back James Daley will drive down the turnout enough that they might also lose that particular referendum. And I think that would be unfortunate. But I agree, the Chicago mayor's race is by far the most fascinating race on the ballot. So what is it you don't get this week? Let's go around the table. Dan Adams.
Charlie, I don't get how former Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann could be so tacky as to publicly compare our president to the homicidal Germanwings pilot who crashed his own plane, killing 144 passengers. Yuck.
Colin Roth.
What I don't get is how, after years of bemoaning the dysfunction on the Wisconsin Supreme Court, editorial boards are lining up to endorse one of the chief instigators of that dysfunction in Justice Ann Walsh Bradley.
Linda Bruin.
Well, what I don't get is why the world reacts with silence and indifference when Christians, including entire Christian communities, have been slaughtered for their faith in the Middle East and Africa. The massacre of 147 students in Kenya last week is the latest example. The gunmen separated students by their faith, killing the Christians, but the media and world leaders are barely mentioning this as an anti-Christian attack.
Brian Sickma.
Well, what I don't get is why the Obama administration's Immigrations and Customs Enforcement is soliciting a contract for license plate reader database that can track millions of people moving about in near real time. But the administration can't seem to keep track of former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's emails.
Well, what I don't get is how the left and the media has turned the defense of religious freedom into a code word for bigotry. You heard that, though. Why doesn't tolerance go both ways? It is a dangerous turn, and we're going to be feeling the consequences for decades. Next on Sunday Inside, our panel picks the winners and losers of the week. But first, here's your morning news update. It is time for our panel to pick the winners and losers of the week. Dan Adams, you're first.
My winners, the Badgers men's basketball team. What an incredible season. My loser, State Senator Chris Larson, who in a national publication stated if Milwaukee's Bradley Foundation weren't here, our community would be better off. Evidently, Larson doesn't believe supporting Milwaukee's Alma Center, Center for Veterans, issues the Ballet, Discovery World, Running Rebels, or countless other nonprofits makes Milwaukeeans better off. A politician will always be a loser when he loses touch with what's important to regular people.
Cullen Roth.
My winner this week is Scott Walker, who at our Insight event this week proved to be far more fluent and prepared to discuss the evolving and complex nature of foreign affairs. This bodes well for him. It'd be easy to say my loser this week is religious freedom, but the real loser is the truth. The public debate over the Indiana law and religious freedom has been marred with so many lies and deceptions that it is enough to make one pessimistic about the prospect of liberty, public discourse, and civil society in America.
Linda Bruin.
Well, on the other side, Governor Pence of Indiana is my loser for supporting a new law in Indiana that initially allowed businesses to practice discrimination under the guise of religious freedom. But he's also my unhappy winner because it was his interview with George Stephanopoulos that showed the public how dangerous the bill really is. Stephanopoulos asked Pence 6 times whether the law would allow businesses to discriminate against gays, and each time Pence dodged the question. His unwillingness to protect the public from discrimination caused businesses to pull their conventions and force the legislature to add anti-discrimination language to the bill.
Brian Sikma.
Well, my loser of the week is Wisconsin's prevailing wage law. Under this law, employers must fill out this complicated and Byzantine survey, and then the state uses the data to calculate how much taxpayers should pay above market wages for government construction projects. But my winner of the week are the taxpayers of Wisconsin, who, according to a new study by the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance, could have saved around $300 million on projects in 2014 if the prevailing wage law was abolished. The savings is there if lawmakers choose to act.
Well, my winners, Christians who celebrate the renewal of life and hope on this Easter Sunday. Losers, Christians around the world who are being singled out and killed for their faith. We live in an age, a new age of martyrs, and it is long past time that the world took notice. Thanks for joining us, and join me for my radio show Monday morning on News Radio 620 WTMJ. Have a great week.